Mayor, a couple questions. President Biden is visiting Crystal Lake tomorrow. Were you invited to that event? Will you go? Will you meet with the president? What's your ask of the federal government for help curbing gun violence? And also, Alderman Anthony Bill sent Governor Pritzker a letter asking for the National Guard to come in, secure downtown, to free up resources for the city, for the neighborhoods. What's your reaction to that?
So we've been through this before. There are some, unfortunately, in the city council that don't want to work collaboratively, that don't come and provide, come to the briefings, work with the police department, but do like to grandstand, and unfortunately you all like to cover it. But I don't think I need to say any more about that. Regarding President Biden, yes, I expect to meet with him tomorrow. I'm not going to Crystal Lake because I'm the mayor of Chicago, but I will see him tomorrow. And as for my ask, I've been making my ask since 2019. And luckily, we now have a president who listened. There are some things that the federal government, when it comes to violence, is uniquely qualified to do. Many of these things really have to lay at the local level, but the things that they're uniquely qualified to do, let me give you a short list. It's not the entire list. Number one, can we please pass common sense gun control measures? You've heard me say this before. It makes no sense that we have a no-fly list of people who are too dangerous to get on a plane, but yet they can purchase firearms. I don't know anybody who's got a functioning brain who thinks that makes sense. It doesn't. And the Congress needs to do its job and pass common sense gun control. We're not talking about intruding upon people's Second Amendment rights. We all have a respect for those. But in a city like Chicago or New York or LA or Boston or St. Louis or Atlanta or Washington, D.C., the list goes on and on. When we're seeing historic levels of violence, homicides and shootings up 20, 30, 40% in some instances, dear God, there's got to be a sense of urgency at the federal level. What more is it going to take? We've seen mass shootings all over the country. We've seen children slaughtered in schools, and yet we see people in Congress sitting on their hands and not doing anything to support residents in this country who are desperate for some solutions from the federal government. What I'll also say is that President Biden announced 2 weeks ago now a set of new policy initiatives that will have impact here in Chicago. For example, I've been talking about for some time, many of the guns that end up on the streets of Chicago are trafficked across state lines from states like Mississippi, traveling up I-65 and landing on the south side and the west side. What that means is we have to have a multi-jurisdictional federal solution. U.S. attorneys, ATF, FBI, and others need to join together, as the president has now announced, and one of those task force will be based here in Chicago. I want those resources today. I'm going to urge the president to make sure that the Department of Justice gets moving as fast as possible so we can bring those resources here. We have to hold gun traffickers accountable. We also have to hold, and this is another part of the president's plan, federally licensed gun dealers responsible. You can't tell me that people that are in the business of selling guns can't tell when somebody is coming into their store, shopping around, but yet the straw purchaser is the person who signs their name on the paperwork. The straw purchaser is the one who then takes possession of the guns. They don't take possession for long. Are they making the handoff in the parking lot or someplace else? I don't know. But what I do know is that we've got to hold these federally licensed gun dealers accountable, because they are responsible for these dangerous guns, weapons of war, being found on our streets. And let me just also say, I want to thank the hotel worker who spotted this individual from Iowa, who decided it was a good idea to come to our city with an arsenal, an AR-15, and 5 loaded magazines that he had perched up on the windowsill. Thank God for that hotel worker who saw something and said something, and I believe averted disaster.
Mayor, just to follow up on that real quick, if I could. This individual was just granted a $10,000 bond. Can you weigh in on that decision by the judges?
Look, I'm not happy about that. Unfortunately, because he was charged with mere possession, illegally here in our city. The charges weren't of the type that he could have been held, but luckily he was questioned by the Joint Terrorism Task Force. He's now on the radar screen of the FBI, and we have to make sure that this individual is somebody who's known to law enforcement, not only here in Chicago, but back in Iowa, where he came from. I've traveled to many states in my day. I didn't think to take an arsenal with me. This isn't a firearm for personal protection. What he had was weapons of war. 5 loaded magazines. That's not, I'm going to the big city and I want to take my weapon. That's something more nefarious. And luckily, because of the really quick work of the hotel worker, a tragedy was averted.
And Mayor, you talked about early on when you were speaking about the weekend violence, you said Chicago police doing everything possible to keep the city safe. But with 100 people shot and 18 killed, does the police department need to rethink its strategy? Apart from the other stuff that you've talked about, does CPD need to rethink its strategy?
Well, just so you know, and the superintendent talked a little bit about this on Friday, every single day they rethink their strategy. They look at the data, they see where the hot spots are, and whether or not their deployments are meeting what the data is showing them in terms of shootings and homicides. So that recalibration happens literally every single day. But we're fighting a losing battle when we are overwhelmed with the number of illegal firearms that are here in our city. CPD obviously has to do its part. The courts, the prosecutors, our federal partners, the community-based organizations, street outreach. It's an entire ecosystem that has to be working seamlessly together and operating at the highest possible levels, but we're all fighting a losing battle if the guns keep streaming over the border from the suburbs, from Indiana, and from the southern states. That's why the federal government is uniquely qualified to help us locally in this fight against violence.
Does that mean, ma'am, that you believe that the strategies were successful? And on that note, Alderman Lopez believes that they were a failure, and he is wondering why you don't ask the Superintendent Brown for his resignation.
Well, I don't think anything that comes out of Alderman Lopez's mouth is really worth my time or consideration. Are there other questions?
That's it, thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.